This production is brought to you by the University of Edinburgh.
Good afternoon, a very warm welcome to you all. As most of you probably know, my name is Jill Haddo, and I have the pleasure of introducing this afternoon's speaker, Professor Graeme Laurie. I'm also extremely pleased that the head of law school, Professor Leslie McCara, will be giving a vote of thanks. As I said, my name is Jill Haddo. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm a social scientist. Specifically, you might want to call me a medical sociologist. I'm also Associate Director of the Mason Institute. For those of you, the uninitiated or the unaware, the Mason Institute was set up in 2012 by Professor Graeme Laurie, of which there will be more of and about later. It's a research network based in the University of Edinburgh. The full title is the Mason Institute for Medicine, Life Sciences and the Law. It is an interdisciplinary network. Interdisciplinarity is not just this year's buzzword like awesome or totes. It is, we believe, a gem. It is, we believe, a gem hidden within the margins of different disciplines, there in the boundaries of different academic specialisms, in the gaps. Herein lies the opportunity for discovery. By challenging you and me to move out of our comfort zones, you can see things a little differently. Let me give you an example, and this is from the book The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Night by Mark Haddon. I quote, "There are 3 men on a train. One of them is an economist, and one of them is a logician, and one of them is a mathematician. And they have just crossed the border into Scotland." I don't know why they're going to Scotland. "And they see a brown cow standing in a field from the window of the train, and the cow is standing parallel to the train. And the economist says, 'Look, the cows in Scotland are brown.' And the logician says, 'No, there are cows in Scotland of which one, at least, is brown.' And the mathematician says, 'No, there is at least one cow in Scotland of which one side appears to be brown.' And it's funny because economists are not real scientists, and because logicians think more clearly, but mathematicians are best." End quote from the book. Interdisciplinarity may do very little to challenge the ego "we are the best" approach, but it does break down the silo approach that some academics may have. At least we're agreed that there are cows in Scotland. But it's through working with colleagues that one comes to view different issues or problems differently, indeed to see what it is that is a problem or a question for you and not for me is an interesting question of itself, if you follow me. The Mason Institute, though, is more than just an academic club. It's because we aim to do research that is out there. It's not just out there as in it's new and it's cutting edge, but it is also quite literally out of academia, engaging with a range of people, from the children who attended our event on cyborgs at the Bioethics Film Festival, to the members of the public and policymakers who come to our MI seminars and lunches, and to the different government advisory bodies whose consultations we have input to. We do this as a group, and we do this as individuals. For example, as I said, I'm a social scientist with a keen interest in the sociology of the body, as well as new and emerging medical technologies. My current research is exploring what life is like for people fitted with an implantable cardiac defibrillator. This research is interesting for a range of audiences, but can also inform, for example, how medical devices are regulated, whether additional support is made available to these individuals and their families, why it is that more men than women get fitted with these devices, and how health professionals are going to cope with increasing numbers of patients who are going to require an ICD. But this revelation of the joy of interdisciplinary working and getting out there is not a new thing. John Kenyon Mason was made Regius Professor of Forensic Medicine 40 years ago, and on this day, the 28th of February 1974, he gave his inaugural lecture called Ambitions for a Motley Coat. In this lecture, Professor Mason talks of the importance of extending forensic medicine as a service for the public. That is, and I quote from that lecture, fed intellectually by contacts with students of many disciplines and extending arms which genuinely welcome and are anxious to provide a full service of cooperation. This is what the Mason Institute hopes to achieve, and this is why we're here tonight. So, how well are we doing? In the last 24 months, the Wellcome Trust, the UK's leading medical charity, has invested significantly in Mason Institute members. I am one of the beneficiaries, Graeme is another. So as Graeme got more funding than I did, I think it's now time that we both invite and congratulate Professor Laurie on gaining a Senior Investigator Award, and he can tell us more about the interdisciplinary and out-there research that he has planned. And although he will be unable to answer any of your questions immediately after the talk, please do grab him at the wine reception or tweet or Facebook him at masoninstitute.org. Professor Graeme Laurie.
Thank you so much, Jill, and thank you to all of you for coming along this evening. It's a real honour to be giving this lecture. It was always part of our plans for the Mason Institute to have an annual lecture series in honour of Ken Mason. But when we realised that tonight was the 40th anniversary of his Regis Chair, we knew that this was the perfect opportunity. And it's a shame that Ken can't be with us on this occasion, but we are recording the event so that he can dissect it forensically in due course, and you can be sure he absolutely will. I feel incredibly lucky to have worked with Ken Mason over the years. I arrived as a junior lecturer in Edinburgh in 1995, intimidated by the reputation of John Kenyon Mason, but I came to realise very quickly that he was as open to my ideas as I was so keenly open to his. We double taught and we amicably fought together for more than 15 years, but it was only when I read recently, to my shame, his inaugural from 1974 that I properly understood his professional philosophy and quite why he's been such an inspiration to so many of us. So tonight what I would like to try and do is to draw on some of that Mason professional philosophy in the sincere hope that I can do justice to the launch of this J.K. Mason annual lecture series. The first thing you must be thinking, having heard the title of his inaugural and seeing the title of mine, well, you both gave lectures 40 years apart, and neither of you have been able to give us a fathomable title. Ken's is probably much easier to explain than mine. So let me attempt first to do that before moving on to share with you my views on the liminal spaces of health research regulation. Ken's inaugural was actually published back in the days when the university published those auspicious occasions. There are very few of these available. I'm very pleased to be a holder of one of them. And in this inaugural lecture, Ken actually addresses the title of his inaugural. This is what he had to say. Some people have questioned the meaning of my title. It stems almost as a matter of course from a Shakespearean quote. Its use does not indicate any erudition on my part, but simply the fact that some 40 years ago, I took the part of Jax in the school production of As You Like It, and it obviously left a mark on me. He goes on to say, you may remember that Jax, a melancholy man, strayed into the forest, and there he met a jester, Touchstone, who obviously impressed him. So much so that Jax returned to his friends and extolled Touchstone, saying, and in his brain, which is as dry as the remainder biscuit after a voyage, he has strange places crammed with observation, the which he vents in mangled form. Oh, said Jax, oh, that I were a fool, I am ambitious for a motley coat. Now, Jill Haddow has already mentioned what were Ken Mason's ambitions back in 1974, and they bear repeating. First of all, to transform a monochrome tradition of forensic medicine to, as he put it, a multicoloured and multi-directional motley coat of community service. And second, one that was fed intellectually by contact with students of many disciplines. Now, Ken played very nicely with several meanings of motley here. First, as something being of different colours combined, and second, something exhibiting great diversity of elements. But he also betrayed his unwavering commitment to and his priority for his students and their learning. We talk nowadays at considerable length of the importance of research-led teaching, but Ken Mason never saw it and never accepted it as any other way. When I told Ken about the success of my application to the Wellcome Trust, which is a 5-year project and £1 million, he paused for a few moments, and he looked serious, and then he said to me, "Well, very nice, dear boy, but is there any teaching involved?" And that sums Ken up perfectly. Now, tenuous though it might seem, this desire by Ken Mason to reveal the multicoloured, multi-directional, motley coat of community service is precisely the ambition that I share in the Wellcome Trust project to confront the liminal spaces of health research regulation. I fear, however, that I'm going to have to do considerably more work than Ken Mason had to do in 1974 to reveal and explain the true nature of my aspirations. And unlike Ken, who can look back over the 40 years with pride of having delivered on his vision, as evidenced by a staggering range of publications both in forensic medicine and in medical law, as well as the generations of medicine and law students that he's taught, I can only hope modestly to lay out for you tonight my plans to attempt to follow in his footsteps. The problem that concerns me with this project is how best to tackle the benefits and the burdens of delivering safe and effective health research. I make no apologies for my normative starting point, which is this: that scientifically sound, ethically robust health research is in the public interest. We all benefit from this. But what can I contribute to this claim as a lawyer? My chair is in Medical Jurisprudence, and this is a relatively young discipline, being not much older than the anniversary we're here to celebrate tonight. It's a discipline that has been significantly shaped by Ken Mason, particularly since the publication of his textbook with Sandy McCall-Smith, Law and Medical Ethics, back in 1983. As one of the first textbooks anywhere in the world to tackle this topic, it grappled with issues on a broad spectrum of questions, reflecting once again Ken Mason's interest in motley subjects that are diverse, vague, and yet to be defined. These included fundamental issues at the heart of the doctor-patient relationship, such as consent, confidentiality, and medical negligence, as well as more societally-oriented topics such as mental health, public health, and health research regulation. But the law at that time was considerably ill-developed and indeed often non-existent in many areas. If you consider as an indication of how the discipline has developed, there's the first edition of the book and its thickness, 1983. There's the 9th edition of its book published last year. Just shows you how the discipline has actually developed across 30 years. Now, one of the areas which is burdened the most in terms of legal developments, case law, and legislative activity at the national, regional, European and international level is health research regulation. And what makes health research regulation potentially so controversial, and what leads understandably to the expectation that there should be heavy regulation in the field, is the fact that it necessarily involves human beings, or their tissues, or their data, or products derived from human beings, such as stem cells, be them embryonic or more recently induced pluripotent stem cells. And in the course of the relatively short lifespan of medical jurisprudence, we've seen a veritable explosion of interest from law and legal institutions in the regulation of health research. And let me give you some examples. So the Human Tissue Act 1961 was 2.5 pages long and consisted only of 4 sections. It dealt with organ donation and little else. Its successor, the Human Tissue Act 2004, which came in the wake of the Bristol and Alderhay scandals involving retention of human body parts, is 25 times longer than the original act. It set up an entire regulatory system that includes the establishment of a statutory governing authority, criminal offences for handling material without a licence, intricate consent procedures, detailed storage and use arrangements, special provisions relating to what are called existing collections, and confirmation of property in samples if scientists do sufficient work on them to turn them into an artefact. It's important to note, however, that only one section of the 2004 Act actually applies in Scotland, Section 45. And this is, to use the colloquial term, the crime of DNA theft. The rest of the Act does not apply in this jurisdiction. Completely separate legislation applies in Scotland on donation, and different procedures govern research access. So for the researcher interested in accessing a range of samples from diverse collections of sources, there are considerable hurdles to overcome. One of the Areas in which Scotland has been leading the way is in the context of what are known as biobanks, collections of tissues and data from participants that can be used as a research resource that allows better to understand the interaction between genetics and environment in the onset of human ill health. One such initiative is the Generation Scotland project, of which a few of us were involved way back in 1993, 2003, and that was led by David Porteous of Edinburgh University and Andrew Morris of the University of Dundee. Andrew Morris is now the Chief Scientist for Health in the Scottish Government. Andrew gave some evidence to the House of Lords in 2009 on their report on genomic medicine, and he talked about some of the challenges and obstacles that they faced in trying to get the Generation Scotland project off the ground. And you can see this second quote here in my slide, just how extensive not only the legislation was that they had to engage with, but also the standards and the professional codes that they had to cover in order to establish Generation Scotland. His point was that there was over-regulation in the field, and it actually almost led to the stalling of the project. In another context, and this is an area where we've done some work with respect to something called the Scottish Health Informatics Programme, which is about data linkage for health research. We've got two reports from a body called the Academy of Medical Sciences, which reported in 2006 and 2011 on the challenges of data linkage. Their conclusion, after effectively surveying the research community, was that we have a culture of caution about data linkage. It is confusing, it's uncertain, and it's inconsistent, and they have put out a clarion call that we need to address this challenge. Now, we might respond to this, of course, by saying, well, all of this is very well if there's actually more research being done and participants are better protected. The problem is there's a significant lack of evidence as to whether or not that is indeed the case. Another concern that sits at the heart of all of these regulatory measures is what I call the fetishization of consent. The idea that somehow to get the consent of individuals to participate in research is somehow a panacea in terms of addressing the ethical and governance challenges that we face. I think that's deeply problematic. It may well be true that, of course, if you're involving individuals with their own body in research, of course you've got to get their consent with respect to any touching. But it's not clear to me that consent offers the same sort of solution when you're talking about the use, for example, of abandoned tissue from a surgery or the use of anonymised data from a medical record. So we have this burgeoning area of laws with respect to health research regulation. The second area that concerns me is the problem of regulators. Again, in 2011, the UK government became aware or did something about the fact that there was this growing concern, and it established something called the Health Research Authority, which is the principal body that is responsible for taking forward health research in a responsible manner in the United Kingdom. More recently, we have before the Westminster Parliament at the moment the Care Bill 2014, and Clause 11 speaks specifically to some of the responsibilities of the Health Research Authority, and I've paraphrased here because actually the text in the draft is exceptionally long. But you can see what it says here, that it imposes upon the Health Research Authority a duty to engage with at least 8 other named authorities that have some say in health research, as well as yet to be specified persons or bodies, in order to coordinate and standardise practices relating to the regulation of health and social care research. Fair enough. More specifically, however, it says that any body or individual charged with such a duty must have regard to 2 principal objectives. The first one here, to protect participants with respect to the safety and efficacy of any research that's conducted, and secondly, to promote their interests as well as facilitating the conduct of such research. In regulatory terms, what this is doing is rather interesting. Not only is it recognising the input of a multiplicity of bodies, but it's laying out dual objectives for them, both in the protection and the promotion of research, which potentially could lead to conflict. Underpinning all of this, the legislation points to a commitment to deliver these sorts of duties in a proportionate manner. My concern, however, is that we currently have no method whatsoever on delivering on these duties. And I believe that there's much that the Academy, across a range of disciplines, can actually provide, both with respect to the methods and also with respect to the discharge of these duties. My third concern and bringing this much more to the topic of my project, is what I call the spatial problem. I believe that there's not been sufficient examination or sufficient understanding of the spatial problem, which I think sits at the heart of all of this, and which we have to address if we want to address the challenges of delivering safe and effective health research. Jill mentioned in her introduction silos. I think if you look at the way in which law regulates health research at the moment, it does so in a silo fashion. We have a whole body of regulation that relates to stem cells, a different body of regulation that relates to tissues, but sometimes they overlap, a different body of regulation that relates to data, but sometimes they overlap, let alone what's going to happen when we're talking about new biomedical terrains such as those that are being pursued by the Wellcome Trust. What that means is that we have a plethora of regulatory practices that do not reflect scientific realities. The scientific realities are that we're trying to produce generalizable knowledge with respect to the public interest, and yet we set up these silos of regulation that do not necessarily speak to one another. The fundamental concern is that this is getting in the way of the Wellcome Trust's fundamental strategic vision, which is to achieve extraordinary improvements in human and animal health. So when I ask the question, what can I contribute as a lawyer? Part of my response is to say, well, the law currently provides edifices of rules and regulations that create spaces of regulation, but in doing so, obscure the spaces in between what's going on in these different areas. And the hypothesis that I want to test in my work is that the law works best when it creates adaptable architectures within which it facilitates and promotes ethical human practices, and not when it attempts to prescribe ethical conduct or drive risk management strategies. So Ken talked about his motley coat, the multicoloured, multifaceted, multidimensional garment. What's mine? Well, this is mine. It's ultimately to effect lasting change across regulation in all fields of biomedicine. To try and do this by reconceptualizing and reorienting current approaches away from overly legalistic, risk-driven practices towards proportionate, adaptive, and authentic partnerships of regulation practice. And I don't believe that we can do that simply from within the discipline of law alone. Well, that's fine, that's nice to have that ambition and vision, but the question, of course, is how are you going to do it? And this brings me to my metaphor of the liminal spaces. I'm trying to explain this title. What are these liminal spaces? I believe that the metaphor of liminal spaces will help us not only to understand what's happening in health research regulation, but also allow us to test the hypothesis that I have put forward. So what are they? I think I can offer you 4 different types of meaning of liminal spaces. First of all, by definition, the term liminal in English comes from the Latin limen, meaning threshold. The idea of a liminal space is the notion of a state or condition of being in between. Often liminality is invoked when something or someone is in transition. For example, in many cultures, young persons go through rites of passage to progress to adulthood. So by crossing the liminal space from child to adult, their legal status changes. If for any reason they're caught in between, their legal status becomes uncertain. But we all understand socially, by social convention, notions of space very, very easily and on a day-to-day basis. We're all acutely aware of the space and the people around us. There are many unspoken conventions and social practices that take place in the spaces between us. And let me give you a very common, everyday example. Imagine you climb the stairs of the number 8 bus on the way home or the way to work, and you find that every 2-seat bench is occupied by one person except one bench. Where do you sit? That bench. Don't you? Well, you certainly do if you're British. The reason why we do that, certainly the British do that, is because we live in a negatively polite society. We respect each other by ignoring each other. We ignore the distance between us. Or rather, we respect the distance between us by ignoring each other. In somewhere like the United States, which is a positively polite society, they actually communicate their politeness by invading each other's space. It would be rude not to. We understand those social conventions. So we know what the worst feeling is in the world is for a Brit who's got to the top of the bus and taken that last seat. It's when the next person comes up the stairs and sits next to you. But we also understand these spaces in everyday culture. I was recently watching a film, Cloud Atlas, by the very talented Wachowskis. This is a very ambitious film based on a book by David Mitchell that interweaves 6 stories of the lives of 6 souls across 6 time periods. And the tagline is, everything is connected. But there's got a wonderful line in that film, which is this. They talk about the silence between notes that holds the key to all music. The silence between notes that holds the key to all music. And I heard that, I thought, that's it. There's something about those spaces, even when it's a silence, that we need to understand in order to understand better what else is going on. And they go on to say, boundaries between noise and sound are conventions. All boundaries are conventions waiting to be transcended. One may transcend any convention if only one can first conceive of doing so. I want this project to transcend boundaries between areas of law, but also between the limits of law and other areas of human practice in the conduct of health research. Finally, we also talk about space in a legal and regulatory context. We do invoke the metaphor of the regulatory space. That's not new. Hansher and Moran put forward this idea in 1998. It's since been picked up by a range of scholars, including Morgan and Young, who have suggested 3 groupings of theories to understand regulatory space, including private interest theories, public interest theories, and institutional theories. While the first of these 2 tend to focus on the actors involved, the last is concerned with the organisational or systemic accounts of how regulation works. Now, my Liminal Spaces project builds on, but I believe transcends, these contributions in at least 3 ways. First, it challenges any implicit or explicit assumption that regulatory space is in any sense a single unitary entity. As we've seen from the silo approach to health research regulation, the reality is far more complex. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't attempt to see health research regulation as a holistic enterprise. Indeed, that's one of the ambitions for my project, but we've got a long way to go from where we are today. Second, this project focuses on law, and in particular the limits of law in its actual operation, but just as importantly, how law is perceived to operate in the regulation and research spheres. With my colleague Neha Sethi, we've recently completed a project I've already mentioned, the Scottish Health Informatics programme, looking at linking data for health research in safe and secure ways. We did a lot of work with the research community out there, and there was a lot of misunderstanding about what the law allowed researchers to do. A lot of the reaction was, we can't do that because it's illegal, and their answer was, no, it's not. If you actually understand the legal architectures that exist, they actually provide you with a lot of flexibilities within which you can operate. But the culture of caution that prevails means that those spaces are not actually filled by the sorts of activity we would hope to promote. So I would hope that liminal spaces and understanding those spaces helps us to fill them. Third, the idea of the liminal space, as opposed simply to the regulatory space, poses particular challenges for law and lawyers because of what it implies. Liminal space is typified by ambiguity, disorientation, uncertainty, and even chaos. These are not concepts or states that make lawyers particularly comfortable. But this project seeks to embrace uncertainty and instability implied by liminality. A liminal spaces framework suggests opportunity to move within and between spaces. It challenges the common response to uncertainty and regulation, which is to call upon more law. That's not to suggest that law does not have a central role to play here. Rather, what I want to try and do is to seek to understand what is the optimal role for law to play in coping with instability and understanding uncertainty in these contentious areas. The key goal of the research is to provide the first ever integrated, interdisciplinary and cross-cutting analysis of health research regulation as it impacts on and often impedes the Wellcome Trust vision of realising extraordinary improvements in human health. The research confronts the gaps between documented law and research practice. These are the liminal regulatory spaces that interest me. The metaphor of the liminal spaces will be deployed in 4 areas, 4 work packages. The 4 packages are first, in the top left-hand corner of the slide. Clogged spaces. This is a shorthand for an exploration of areas where we might consider there's regulatory congestion. Hopefully we can look at areas such as genetics and genomics to deliver lessons across other areas where we might say that there's been over-regulation up until now. In contrast, moving over to the right, the second space are the empty spaces. These explore the grey, unregulated areas in the field of experimental therapies. And that's particularly important for the commitment of the Wellcome Trust to understanding the human brain. Moving down, the third work package will look at dangerous spaces. And what I want to do here is engage regulatory hindrances that can arise in the spaces between public and private endeavours in health research. The recent allegations of sales of patient data down south are a very good but worrying example of exactly what interests me here. And fourthly, we have transitional spaces. Here I want to examine opportunities to accelerate medical advances by anticipating regulatory responses. And this will drive in particular one of the most undeveloped areas of the Wellcome Trust work, which is in relation to connecting environment, nutrition and health. Now, each of these spaces raises distinct questions about law, the limits of law, and what counts as effective regulatory response. The programme will deploy interdisciplinary methods, and it will involve ongoing engagement with research communities and regulators to provide a new model of health practice. I'm very pleased that the chair of the Health Research Authority, Professor Jonathan Montgomery from UCL, is actually a member of the External Advisory Board, as is Aidan Courtney from Roslin-Sells, who's here tonight. Thank you very much, Aidan, for coming along. We're going to engage, hopefully, with the HRA, as well as other bodies such as the National Institute for Healthcare and Excellence, to have case studies that understand exactly what's happening in practice. This model, I believe, embraces a realistic role for law and enables more effective regulation as the co-production of ethical behaviour. So my overarching research questions that we want to answer in the course of the 5 years are these. What's happening in these liminal spaces of health research regulation? What lessons can we learn across sectors and across jurisdictions? And how can we better exploit liminal regulatory spaces? What I want to do in the second half of the lecture is just to say a little bit more about each of these work packages, each of these types of spaces that I've identified, and draw on some recent work to suggest where the Liminal Spaces project might actually take us. Let's start, first of all, with clogged spaces. Together with one of our colleagues in the Medical College, Sarah Cunningham-Burley, and a former researcher with us, Dr. Catherine Hunter, we recently published a report for the Scottish Government on what's called the Guthrie card collection. Guthrie cards are straightforward. They exist in most Western countries. They involve blood spots taken from newborn children. It involves a heel prick to the child. There are spots put on a card, and the cards are tested for a number of conditions, such as cystic fibrosis, sickle cell disease, and phenylketonuria. What's interesting about Guthrie card collections, however, is that in most countries they are retained. So in Scotland, for example, the collection was started in 1965, and there are now over 2.5 million cards held in York Hill Hospital in Glasgow. We were approached by the Scottish Government to ask us, is this lawful? Can we use it? If we can use it, for what purposes? Because many of these people, including myself, born in 1968, don't need to know whether or not I'm suffering from sickle cell anemia or any of these conditions. But those cards are held. The concern was particularly acute because of what happened recently in Texas. In Texas, they had a collection of 5.3 million cards held on children developed between 2002 and 2009. The collection was used, among other things, for anonymised research in over 8,000 cases, always with ethical approval, and research projects included the investigation of genetic causes of deafness. They made sure that all such projects were made public on the Department of State Health Service website. A challenge, however, was raised to the collection by the Texas Civil Rights Project, claiming that this was an invasion of their constitutional rights. And that claim to having a legal interest in the collection and its ongoing retention was upheld by the courts. There was some prospect of negotiation that the collection might nonetheless continue, up until the point that it became clear that what happened at some point was access had been given to the collection whereby 800 samples had been sent to a federal armed forces mitochondrial database to assist in the ethnicity categorization of the remains of missing persons. And crucially, a Freedom of Information request revealed that although the state had contemplated engaging the Texas public about this, they decided not to do so for fear that there might be a backlash. Of course, what happened when this came to light, there absolutely was a backlash, and the result was the Texas collection, the entire collection, had to be destroyed. In terms of the Scottish position, we therefore make it one of our prime recommendations that there needs to be very robust and ongoing engagement with the Scottish public about exactly what's going on here. But what I'm interested in tonight is the legality of this collection, how it raises questions and challenges for liminal spaces and regulation. Because different legal regimes govern the Guthy collections in Scotland as opposed to England. In England, for example, the view tends to be that the cards are treated as tissue, and therefore they're governed by the Human Tissue Act that I mentioned previously. In Scotland, our research revealed that actually they seem to be treated much more as part of the medical record, and therefore they're governed principally by the Data Protection Act 1998 and also the common law of confidentiality. But more recently, in the decision of Marper against the UK, which related to the legality of the forensic DNA database that Ken Mason would be very familiar with respect to holding DNA on people who have been arrested or charged with offences in the UK, it was held to be illegal for the UK to have indefinite retention of people's DNA unless you went on to charge them or convict them of a crime. You couldn't just arrest somebody, take their DNA and then hold it indefinitely, which is what had been happening previously. But from a legal point of view, what the European Court of Human Rights said was that these DNA is both tissue and data. So if you think back to my silos comment, that means that you have to comply both with the tissue regulations and with the data regulations. So it's a cumulative regulatory build. What's missing from all of this is any sense of proportionality of what we're trying to regulate. That's what I think this kind of clog space reveals. It also reveals limits of consent as well. If you think about the Scottish collection back to 1965, are we seriously going to say that we're going to try to consent everybody right the way back to 1965, let alone the logistics of finding people that are even still in the country, but what would be the transaction economic costs of trying to do that? There are serious limits if we think that consent can actually deliver appropriate and optimal governance arrangements, then something like this cannot possibly continue. So here the liminal spaces that I'm concerned with are the spaces between regulatory regimes, tissue and data. Contrast that with empty spaces. I was recently involved in this report produced by the Nuffield Council on bioethics and was managed very ably by one of our colleagues, Emily Postum, and it relates to novel neurotechnologies. These are technologies that deal with people who are suffering from neurological conditions. They are technologies such as transcranial magnetic stimulation, where you put fields of energy around somebody's head, brain-computer interfaces, where you might wear a cap and you might someday be able to sort of control your games in that kind of fashion, or much more invasive techniques such as deep brain stimulation, which includes insertion of electrodes into the brain and the passing of a current in order to deal with certain types of symptoms. Now, on deep brain stimulation, there's actually growing evidence that it can be helpful in some conditions, conditions such as Parkinson's with tremor, depression, stroke, or OCD. Problem is, we don't really understand how deep brain stimulation works, and it's highly invasive. Imagine you're a patient who's suffering from a severe tremor from Parkinson's, and you run out of options. DBS might be your last best hope. Is it appropriate that we move forward? Is it legal that we do so? The liminal space we're concerned with here is that patients are stuck between treatments, when you've run out of treatments, and robust research mechanisms. Normally with research you might go down a clinical trial route, but clinical trials are very heavily regulated from a European directive, and they require a very strong evidence base before you actually move forward. With these types of conditions, you're often dealing with very small groups of patients and the evidence base simply isn't there. So you can't go down the robust research route, and yet you've run out of treatment options. So the patients are stuck in that liminal space where it's effectively experimentation. So the question there is, how should we proceed? The Nuffield Council in its report, among many recommendations, suggests that what we require is a robust engagement with the networks of practitioners and patients who are actually engaging in these types of activities. That we need registers that can actually record the instances of use, the side effects, and how patients actually respond. It's a grassroots movement. It does not require more law. In contrast, and just yesterday, the Department of Health down south produced a consultation on the new Medical Innovations Bill. This has come from Lord Saatchi, who lost his wife tragically to cancer. It's his firm conviction that a fear of being innovative in a therapeutic context led partly to the death of his wife. And, and he believes it's a fear of a negligence action that meant that the clinicians were not more willing to engage with the options that they could have explored. So what this bill is trying to do is to say that if clinicians take decisions according to a set of laid down criteria in the statute, then this will absolve them from any future negligence action. So this is a very determinedly legalistic way of trying to promote interventions in this field. Very interesting, only came out yesterday. The consultation closes on the 25th of April. The Mason Institute will certainly be putting in a submission. I would encourage anybody else who's interested to do so as well. So those are the empty spaces. Dangerous spaces. I'm grateful to NHS England for my next example, although they're not quite so appreciative that these issues have attracted so much attention. I can't believe there's anybody in the audience who has missed the care.data debacle. This is an initiative to collate patient-relevant information in order to improve services and commissioning within England in the NHS. There have been allegations of sale of data which are not grounded. There's a lot of misinformation and confusion about what's exactly proposed. I don't want to talk about that particularly, but what I do want to sort of point out is that this raises a serious question about the regulatory spaces and the divide between the public and the private. A lot of the anxiety has been driven by the prospect of commercial involvement. The danger here, that's why it's a dangerous space, is the potential chilling effect that prospect of profit can actually have on the advancement of health research. But the issues are not as clear-cut as we might imagine, or they're being portrayed in some quarters in the press. Much work, including work carried out by our dear colleague Jill Haddo, has indicated that there's a real difference in opinion depending on which groups you actually engage with on these sorts of issues. For example, healthy publics tend to be a lot less tolerant of commercial involvement than do patient groups, because patient groups have either experienced a relationship with commercial entities or simply want the work to be done. So there's a lot more nuance going on there than we might think. Jill and I were involved in a project a few years ago which engaged publics around the Generation Scotland project that I mentioned earlier on. That also revealed anxiety around commercialisation, but it was a much more subtle message, wasn't it? The message was, yes, we're concerned about commercial involvement, but it's not the prospect of profit that's a problem, it's the prospect of excess profit. It's obscene profit. It's the idea that somehow we're being abused and exploited. Now, of course, that gives rise to questions about, well, what counts as obscene? But nonetheless, we need to understand exactly what's going on there. And one of the solutions that we put forward in that context and we want to explore in the Liminal Spaces project is the idea that perhaps benefit sharing, a commitment to entities, whether they be public or private, might actually act as a bridge between the public and private spheres and transcending these dangerous liminal spaces when it comes to commercialisation. As these examples show, the current reality is that regulation is unevenly distributed across the range of landscapes of biomedical practice. The Liminal Spaces project is designed to engage across these landscapes and into areas where we're not yet certain about what regulatory response is even required. And one such area is in a field of work that the Wellcome Trust is promoting at the moment, which is environment, nutrition and health, itself a vast field of inquiry. Now, this example of transitional spaces is concerned with what we might call the regulatory blank page. This is where areas of emerging scientific research beg questions about how should law and regulation respond. In this space, what I hope we can do is to extend further the work that we've done recently in what we call legal foresighting. Our colleague Sean Harman and I have worked over the last few years with the Argentinian Ministry of Science technology and innovative production. I love this little logo that Sean put together, the Scottish and the inverted Scottish and the Argentinian flags, which ran from 2007 to 2012. It was led by Sean in Edinburgh and by our dear colleague Fabiana Arzuaga in Argentina. It looked at stem cell regulation, and the position in Argentina was a regulatory blank page. What it led to, what it meant there was a lot of stem cell tourism. There were stories of people being injected with stem cells. There were stories of deaths. It was all confusing and distressing. The research that was conducted involved engagement with scientists, with law and policy makers, and the imagining of possible futures, legal futures, regulatory futures. That's what we mean by legal foresighting. What the research revealed was an appetite for legal intervention, a top-down approach from the government in order to regulate appropriately stem cell research in that particular country, both to protect and also to promote responsible science. And it led ultimately to a legal proposal to the Argentinian Congress. Academically, Sean, Fabian and I developed a publication on a method for legal foresighting, and what we hope to do is to extend that in the Liminal Spaces project. It's interesting actually that we did look at the notion of method, because I think that's one area where lawyers in particular are particularly weak. The last time I won any money from any funder, it was with the AHRC, and I had to go for an interview, and the very, very first question was, well, so what's your method for approaching this research? I thought, damn it, I don't know. We read cases, and we write about them. We don't. I think lawyers are getting better, though. I think we are, and I hope that this project helps us to do so. The transitional space is one which probably typifies most uncertainty, and therefore it's one where most work is to be done to understand whether and how a better understanding of the liminal spaces of health research regulation can help us to realise the overarching ambition that I outlined earlier. But what's going to count as success for the Liminal Spaces project? Well, a helpful indication was given by one of the referees on my application to the Wellcome Trust, who asked this question. Can the framing of the regulatory issues in terms of liminal spaces promise to facilitate the inquiry in a way that more traditional terminology would not? I can't answer that question, and I'm very glad I can't, because if I could, it wouldn't merit a 5-year project. But I do think there's value in this approach. It brings together loose metaphors to help us understand systematic relations. The language of space and liminal space, I believe, will help us to capture what law is doing, but also, just as importantly, what it's not doing. And I hope that it will reveal the symbiotic relationship between law and human practices. And as my dear friend and colleague Niamh Nic Sivanna said to prospective PhD students just last week about the thought of embarking on any long-term research project, it's got to be driven by curiosity. This one most definitely is. It's also driven by a deep interest in design, and I'm also very grateful to Niamh for helping me come up with the logo, which we've got already, and also sincere thanks to Farron Ball for the colours. Finally, to return to curiosity, this is one of the many virtues that brings this lecture back to Ken Mason. It is palpable to me, and I think to many others, that curiosity has kept Ken going over the years. It inspired him to change careers after retiring. He moved from forensic medicine to medical law, and it spurred on a generation of students to study medical jurisprudence. And I would invite you to consider once again this quote from Ken Mason's inaugural, delivered 40 years ago tonight. I believe that Ken was communicating something more here, something more besides his passion and his ambition to contribute to his discipline. Oh, that I were a fool. I think there's a real sense of humility in that, as there's always been in everything that Ken Mason's ever done. So, Ken Mason's spirit of intellectual inquiry, his intellectual generosity, and his constant openness to new ideas inspired us to set up the Mason Institute. I'm honoured to follow in his footsteps and in turn to work with exceptionally committed colleagues in the Institute who share John Kenyon Mason's ambitions. I'm privileged that the Wellcome Trust has the trust in me to take forward the Liminal Spaces project. I hope that I can do justice to that trust, but most importantly, I hope I can make John Kenyon Mason proud. Thank you.
Well, it's my great privilege and great honour, actually, to be asked to offer the vote of thanks for this lecture. In his lecture, Graeme has talked a great deal about architecture, and I think it's appropriate that the inaugural Kenyon Mason lecture should be actually given in this particular venue, which is our wonderful lecture theatre here, because the architecture of Old College, and this lecture theatre in particular, as the former anatomy lecture theatre in the university, carries the weight of our Enlightenment heritage, but is also emblematic of the fusion of medicine and law, the field of study which we're celebrating today, and actually which has for a long time threaded through our history. Now, I'm not sure whether this space in your metaphor counts as a clogged, an empty, a transitional or a dangerous space. I rather want it to be a transitional and a dangerous space, because I think that's where the gems of interdisciplinarity are to be found that Jill was mentioning in her very warm introduction. Now, this evening we are honouring two scholars, Professor Ken Mason and Professor Graeme Laurie, who've both had a significant impact on the life and indeed the history of the law school. Now, as we've already heard, Ken has a bent for a very memorable title. I love the ambitions for a motley coat. And I was looking through his bibliography and found another one which I really like, and I think which sums up the thing I want to say about Ken and Graeme. One of his journal articles published in the Edinburgh Law Review is called Unalike as Two Peas. Think about that, that's a very clever little metaphor. Unalike as two peas, and that's how I think of you. And I'll tell you why. Because aside from the joint writings and teaching collaborations, the thing that marks them out as two peas in a pod is the type of academic which they are. A type of academic that we cherish at Edinburgh and who should form a role model for all you young scholars here and younger generations of scholars to come. Now, what is that type? Well, first of all, it's an academic who sees it as their vocation to be an educator, inspiring generations of students through the excellence of their teaching as an educator. It is an academic who also realises step change in respect of their own core disciplinary paradigm and crafts their research agenda of the highest ethical standards, the results of which flow into policy and practice and make a difference to the wider world. And it's someone who will always be remembered as an outstanding academic citizen through contributions made to the well-being and smooth running of the scholarly communities here in the school, the university and their discipline. Both Ken and Graeme love the university ideal. I think this comes through in everything that they do. And they are passionate in their defence of scholarship and the necessary conditions for its pursuit. Thomas Carlyle, who, as I'm sure you all know, was one of the major literary figures in the Scottish Enlightenment, but he was also a formal pupil in the law faculty here. He studied here for a while. And he once wrote, and I love this quotation, I think this sums up Ken and Graeme, "Blessed is he who has found his work. Let him ask no other blessedness." And I feel very blessed and privileged in knowing them and counting them amongst my friends as well as colleagues. So both Ken and Graeme are characterised by extreme generosity of spirit, and I'm sure anyone who's ever had a drink with Ken will know this. I've been given grams that have been like half pints of whiskey. And in that spirit, and in a few minutes I'm going to ask you to make your way down to the Lorimer room for more of the good stuff. Jill Haddo invoked the spirit of Conan Doyle in her introduction, and I want to end this vote of thanks with a quote from The Sign of Four, which I think sums up Graeme's forensic interrogation of liminality and the possibilities of this metaphor as the foundations for his visionary Wellcome Trust programme. "Excellent," I cried. "Elementary," he replied. Please join me in thanking Graeme again for this wonderful inaugural lecture.
This production is copyright the University of Edinburgh.